card so we can mail it to you. My background is astrophysics, and I've been a pastor for the past 4 decades as well. And people ask me, well, what is a pastor and astrophysicist doing with UFOs? And it was because I was an amateur astronomer before I became a professional astronomer. Many of you know my story that I got captivated by astronomy and physics when I was 7 years of age. I was reading 4 or 5 books in astronomy and physics every week. And I saved up money to build a telescope. Actually went around, our neighborhood had a lot of drunks. I went around the neighborhood collecting beer bottles and converted that into money for a telescope mirror and wound up making myself a telescope. And then I joined the astronomy club in Vancouver, British Columbia. And when I was 16, they made me the director of observations for the club because I knew the night sky so well. And when I was the director of observations, I said, you know, we really need to have a booth at the Pacific National Exhibition. It's the second biggest exhibition in North America. So they gave us a booth there, but they put us right next door to the Flying Saucer Club. And so people would go to the Flying Saucer Club booth, and they would come to our booth and say, you know, what do you think of what they're saying there? Or they would say, you know, I had this experience last summer where I saw this thing moving in the sky, and can you tell me what I've been seeing? And because I knew the night sky so well, I was able to identify what a lot of them thought were unidentified flying objects. And then what happened is when I went on to begin my undergraduate work at the University of British Columbia, the professors there figured out, hey, here's the student that actually knows the night sky. We're going to give him all the UFO reports that we get at the university. So I wound up having the job of handling UFO reports. And then I went on to the University of Toronto. And once again, the reputation followed me. Hey, you get to take care of all the UFO reports. And then I went on to Caltech. Everywhere I've been, I was a guy who had to handle the UFO reports. So I wound up with decades of experience of studying UFOs. And then as this is actually, when we launched Reasons to Believe, I got contacted by a group that said, would you consider doing a speaking trip to Russia? I says, this is before perestroika happened. The communists were still in control, but they were concerned about their academics, especially about their scientists, because their scientists were actually going to international conferences. And the scientists were causing some problems for the communist government. And so they contacted me and a few other Western research scientists who were Christians and said, would you come to the Soviet Union? We're going to pay all of your expenses when you're in the country. Will you come and speak to our scientists? And our scientists want you to speak on science and the Christian faith. And I thought, well, this is interesting given the atheist situation. But they also said, there's one very important caveat. If we ever catch you sharing your Christian faith with someone who doesn't have a doctoral degree in the sciences, you'll be immediately deported and never allowed back into our country. And we're going to be watching you. And so there were KGB agents that were with us making sure we didn't step out of bounds. And they said, they get to pick the topics, not you. And so they said, please give us a list of whatever topics you feel you can speak on. So I thought, well, okay, I came up with a list of 30 different lectures I could give on different science-based topics. And what was interesting is while I was in the Soviet Union, over half of the requested talks were on UFOs and extraterrestrial life. So, and what I discovered was the incidence of people experiencing UFO encounters in the Soviet Union was way higher than anything I saw in Canada or the United States. And this led to us writing a book on the topic, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. I want to begin by sharing with you about the identified. 99% of what people would come to me and say, I had this UFO encounter, and I got to tell you about it. 99% of them I could explain as either a natural phenomena, some kind of military exercise, or a hoax. And in Canada, a lot of them are hoaxes. I mean, almost every undergraduate engineering school loved to generate a UFO buzz. And so they would actually set up these things and get things flying in the atmosphere. And these days, it's much more common that we have these hoaxes because you can buy these drones for not much money. And you can get them doing some really weird things at night, put special lights on them. So the UFO encounter experience has actually gone way up, but a lot of it is just simply hoaxes that people pull off with their little fancy drones. But I'll share with you what are the most common identifications. Number one at the list is the planet Venus. And what people don't realize is that Venus in the morning is way brighter than it is in the evening. And I was surprised how few people in Canada and the United States have ever seen Venus, as the Bible says, the bright morning star. So it can be more than 10 times as bright in the morning than it is in the evening. In fact, I've seen Venus so bright you can read a newspaper by it. You know, and people see Venus and this is a UFO. And probably the most humorous report I ever got was from the California Highway Patrol, where they're reporting this object to us at the observatory, and they were telling me they were gaining on the UFO. And I told them, you're not going to catch up with it. You're chasing the planet Venus. And the other thing that was really common when I was in Canada is people would say, I see these 7 spaceships coming over the horizon. Well, Canada is at high enough latitude that the Pleiades star cluster, when it's rising, just hovers over the horizon, and it kind of rises level to the horizon for about an hour. So a lot of the reports I got were the star cluster, the Pleiades. But I also got used to asking people, okay, you saw these bright lights on the horizon. Where were you when you saw those bright lights? And in particular, were you inside? And they said, well, yeah, why do you ask? Well, was there a pane of glass between you and what you saw on the horizon? Well, yes. Was there a chandelier behind you? Okay, it's the chandelier effect. With the glass there, you're going to get an image projected on the horizon showing these little bright balls, and it's just and if the glass is not high quality, it's going to be kind of fuzzy. People say, I see these fuzzy bright balls. And I realized, well, okay, your pane of glass isn't the greatest, and it's generating that effect. So, but I've also seen more strange things happen. For example, where this fast-moving object would be zipping through the atmosphere and stop and hover. In fact, that actually happened to me when I was doing observations at the Algonquin Radio Observatory. This thing came roaring across the sky and stopped right over our telescope, and it was actually causing problems with our observations. And we kind of figured it out, okay. NORAD, which is the headquarters of the North American Air Defense, that was in North Bay, which was just 80 miles away from our telescope. And so we figured, okay, this has got to be some NORAD thing. So we called the Air Force, and they said, no way do we have any kind of aircraft with that capability. Because we basically said, could you please have your pilots not hover over our telescope? And keep in mind, this is the late 1960s, and they insisted that they had no aircraft with that capability. But we found a way around it. We said, well, if you're not going to help us, we'll contact the Ottawa newspapers. And they said, well, don't do that. And so they said, don't worry, it's not going to happen again. Well, about a decade later, we found out that Britain and the United States were working together to develop these jet aircraft that could actually stop and hover. They're called Harrier jump jets. Well, back then, they didn't want anybody to know they had that kind of technology. That's just one example of how the military does things that they don't want you to find out about. And of course, that's the reason why there's so much interest in Area 51. It's like, okay, here's this secret Air Force Base, and that's where they're hiding UFOs. And so many people have been penetrating Area 51 that the United States Air Force said, okay, we're going to solve this. They doubled the size of Area 51. And actually, I can tell you, having worked with or spoken to these Air Force people, that's not the really black ops site. I won't tell you what the black ops site is, but there's actually a base in California where the really secret stuff is going on. But they're quite happy having everybody worry about Area 51. So, okay, if they all focus on Area 51, they're not going to discover what we're really up to. So military, that goes on, and of course, a lot of them are hoaxes. But over the decades, we discovered that there was a 1% residual, a 1% residual that could not be explained as natural phenomena. Oh, by the way, a really big one, I've had to ask people, okay, when you had this UFO encounter, how long were you outside in the dark? And they say, well, about 10 minutes. And I said, well, you didn't really have a UFO encounter. Our eyes take 20 minutes to dark adapt, and some people it takes 30 minutes. And during that 20 to 30 minute window, your eyes will see bright objects in the sky where they're not there. And that's just because of the dark adaptation. You've been inside, you've been exposed to bright lighting, and I've had that experience myself, because I have my own little telescope, and I realize that for the first 20 or 30 minutes, my eyes are going to be fooling me. And so, wait. And so I would ask them, were your eyes fully dark adapted? And they say no. Then I say, okay, I know what was going on. And of course, there's phenomena that happens when you're in swampy regions. And, people have reported clusters of fireflies. I mean, there's phenomena like that. But I want to talk to you about the 1% residual. And we're talking millions of documented cases. I mean, I mentioned the Soviet Union. Within the Soviet Union, by itself, it had over 5 million documented cases of people having UFO experiences that didn't fall in that 99% category. So it's a huge database. I mean, when I was at the University of Toronto, I had Carl Sagan for a week as a professor, and he was very dismissive of UFOs, but he was not aware of the extent of the database. He assumed there was only a few people having these kinds of reports, and that therefore this is something we shouldn't be believing. But it really is now north of 20 million sightings. So it's a huge database. Now, a lot of the data is not that helpful. People will typically say, I saw this thing coming through the atmosphere at a high velocity, and then it stopped and hovered. And it's like, well, if you're the only observer, we can't really tell how fast the object was moving. But there are situations where they are able to triangulate, where they got multiple observers seeing the thing pass through the atmosphere. Then we can actually determine what was the path of the entry through the atmosphere, how fast it was moving. And what's really interesting is the speed of motion has been going up through the decades. So back around 1900, 1910, the UFOs were reported at moving at 100 miles an hour. Then in World War II, they were the Foo Fighters that were moving at about the speed of sound. Then when you get to about 1960, they're moving at 6,000 miles an hour. And the velocity's been going up, where you're able to triangulate. Now they got them going as fast as 25,000 miles an hour. So that kind of got me as I've been studying this over the decades. They seem to be keeping pace with our technology. And then there are people who have these close encounters. You're probably aware of Alan Hynek. He was assigned by the US government to do a thorough research of the UFO phenomena. This is in the 1960s and early 1970s. He's passed away. But he was the one that coined the term close encounters. Close encounters of the first kind, close encounters of the second kind, the third kind, the fourth kind. And a close encounter of the first kind is where you have this 1% residual where the human has an encounter with a UFO within 500 feet or less. So we're talking a close encounter. And with the second encounter, they actually see phenomena like the thing crashing into the earth. And then close encounters of the third kind is where there's communication going on, where they claim to get a communication from beings that are on board this craft. And then of the fourth kind is where there's serious injury or death. So that kind of gives you, and depending who you read, there's 3 kinds of close encounters, 4 kinds or 5 kinds, but it's kind of like the closer you get, and people claim to have been abducted on board these craft. That's another category of a close encounter. But anything closer than 500 feet meets Alan Hynek's close encounter category. And where we do have triangulation, and we can see the velocity coming through, I was mentioning they keep pace with our technology. They keep pace in another way, where there's actually a message being communicated from the UFO knot or the UFO being to the human being. They're keeping pace with the lay level of astrophysical knowledge. So again, going back to 1900, the story was we are beings from the backside of the moon. But then the public got educated enough to realize life is not possible on the backside of the moon. And so the new story was, well, we're from Venus. And then when the public became aware of how hot it is on the surface of Venus, they said, we're from Mars. And that takes you back to about the 1990s. The story we're getting now is that they're from a distant planetary system. So they've crossed interstellar space. Because the general public now realizes the only planet that's habitable in our solar system is our planet Earth. So they must be from another planetary system. And they're now saying distant planetary system, because again, the public is aware there's no nearby systems where intelligent life is possible. So that's kind of the story that's out there. But that's an important data point. Why are they keeping pace with our technology? Why are they keeping pace with our understanding of what's going on in astronomy? The other thing that was really interesting, the story of where they're from, it was sufficient to convince the lay public, but not sufficient to convince the astronomers and physicists. So back in 1900, the astronomers and physicists realized backside of the moon is not credible. And so there were people at that educational level who realized this is not correct science that we're receiving through these communications. But the vast majority of people were taken in by that comment. But probably the most significant data points of this is that when they were able to track them going through the atmosphere, where we got triangulation, and they're moving at these very high velocities, 9,000 miles an hour, 15,000 miles an hour, up to 26,000 miles an hour, there's not a single cited case where they see heat friction or they hear a sonic boom. That's a very important data point. No sonic boom, no evidence of heat friction. I've had the opportunity to watch one of those, the Challenger, what do you call it, the spaceships, the space shuttle, yeah, space shuttle. I've seen a couple of space shuttles go through the atmosphere because one of the landing places is where we are in Southern California. And when it goes through the atmosphere, you see this bright glow of heat friction as it encounters the atmosphere. In fact, that's what's kind of fun. You kind of can track the space shuttle, and the moment it hits our atmosphere, you see this bright glow. And you get to hear a double sonic boom, and it's quite dramatic. But with the UFOs, never is there a sonic boom, no heat friction. And now there's more than 2,000 documented cases where people have been able to track the UFO going through the atmosphere and it crashing into the earth. And you can actually go to these crash sites. And what do you see at the crash site? You see a shallow depression. It's not a deep crater. The crater typically measures anywhere from 4 inches to 16 inches deep. But it is a crater. And if there's snow on the ground, the snow is melted. And always the vegetation is damaged. But then when you go to the crash site, there's no debris, there's no artifacts. Okay, we all know what happens when an aircraft crashes into the earth. You go there, you can recover the black box, and there's all kinds of debris lying around. With the UFOs, there's nothing to recover. Now, you'll hear lots of stories in the UFO literature of how they've recovered pieces of the UFO spacecraft, or they've even got bodies that our U.S. government is covering up, which is one reason for our book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. We had Dr. Mark Clark come in as a co-author. Mark Clark is a national securities expert. He was with the Reagan administration, and he's now the chairman of the Department of National Security Studies at the University of California, San Diego State, or San Bernardino State. And the reason why we had him write a couple of chapters in our book is to dispel this idea that the governments of the world are covering up the physical data of UFOs. And he basically makes the point, national security in the United States is not up to the task. The idea that our government has covered up the bodily remains of UFO beings and their spaceship in some secret place outside of Roswell, New Mexico, is that, well, here's the evidence. We had a U.S. president with all the power of the presidency behind him, and he tried to cover up an 11-minute segment of an audio cassette tape. How many days was he able to keep that covered up from the public? And it was only a few days. So the idea that our U.S. government has the security capability of covering up 4 UFO bodies in a secret hangar along with their spaceship, he says there's no credibility to that. And he basically makes the point, look, I've studied Soviet security. It's a whole lot better than our security, but even Soviet security is not up to the task. That was important when I was visiting the Soviet Union, because that was a rumor running all over the Soviet Union, that the Soviet government was covering up the real hard evidence of this. And I was able to share with the scientists there. I think it was a good thing they only let me speak to scientists, because they were aware, when we look at how many mistakes our government makes, they're not going to be able to cover it up either. We know the U.S. government can't do it, our government can't do it either. So, so I'm here to tell you there is zero physical evidence of beings in physical craft. And I wrote a chapter in Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, basically making the point is that the story now is that they're from a distant planetary system. And that immediately tells us we're not being visited by physical beings traveling to us in a spaceship. And I made a comment about this yesterday. But even in that book written a few years ago, I was making the point that when you watch these movies of these spaceships moving at warp 9, warp 8, the laws of physics are such you're not going to be able to go warp 1. And that means traveling at the velocity of light. However, a colleague of ours is part of our scholar community at Reasons to Believe. He's the chairman of the physics department at Baylor University. And we interviewed him, and he says, we found a way to go faster than the velocity of light. Not a lot faster, but 1 or 2% faster than the velocity of light. And how you do it, you gravitationally distort the space-time fabric of the universe. And so if we can expend enough energy that we can distort the space fabric just above the spaceship, we can move about 2 or 3% faster than the velocity of light. But I asked them, I said, okay, how much energy do you have to expend to be able to warp the space-time fabric sufficiently you can go a little bit faster than the velocity of light? He says, oh yeah, that's in our research paper. You need to convert the mass of Jupiter into pure energy every second to make that happen. So you're not going to be able to go warp 1. Moreover, there's another problem. The faster the velocity you move through interstellar space, the more damage you're going to do to your spaceship from the particles that are there. Now, it is true that interstellar space is essentially a vacuum, but there are particles there. There's at least 1 proton every cubic centimeter. And so that's not a lot, but when you're moving at 10% the velocity of light, that particle is hitting your spaceship and doing a lot of damage. And yet I'm aware that there could be civilizations that are far more advanced than us, but however advanced they are, they're subject to the laws of physics. And the laws of physics basically say, if you've got a physical craft, it's going to get damaged by those particles. And they say, if you go, say, 20% of velocity of light, the damage is going to be 4 times greater, because the damage goes up with the square of the velocity. And so people have figured out, and I wrote in Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, maximum velocity you could travel, if you're trying to put beings our size inside of a spaceship, is about 1% the velocity of light. And we've already determined through searches for extraterrestrial intelligent life, there's nothing within 250 light years, which means you're looking at 25,000 years to make a one-way trip. Okay, that is significant because there's been numerous papers published in scientific literature that the maximum time any intelligent civilization that's subject to the laws of physics can maintain a level of technology equivalent to what we had post-World War II is 2,000 years. Anything longer than 2,000 years is not sustainable. So if you got a trip that takes longer than 2,000 years, it's not going to happen. Well, it turns out I was way too conservative in that book. You cannot go 1% the velocity of light. You got to go slower. And this is all the result of a study done a couple of years ago. What would it take for us to send spaceships, not spaceships with people on it, but just spaceships, machines, to the nearest star? And the excitement is the nearest star has a planet orbiting it. And I can already tell you, we know enough about that planet that it's not a candidate for life. But astronomers are saying it's only 4.25 light years away. We could actually visit that planet and learn things about that planet we'll never learn just through looking at it through telescopes. So there's actually a mission that's being planned right now to visit that nearest exoplanet. But they quickly realize what it's going to take to send a machine to visit that planet and send back information that's worthwhile. And they quickly figured out, okay, if we send a big spaceship, it's going to get destroyed by the particles. It's got to be a small enough spaceship that it can escape particle destruction. And they've determined that the largest spaceship they can send is 10 centimeters across. Anything bigger than 10 centimeters will be destroyed before it gets there. And even when it's 10 centimeters, the odds aren't good. So the plan that's being proposed to be funded by US taxpayers is to send 1,000 spaceships to the nearest star, where each spaceship is no bigger than 10 centimeters, with the expectation that at least half of them will be destroyed. The other half will be damaged, but they'll be damaged in different ways. And so enough spaceships will get there that they will be able to send back useful information to planet Earth. Mind you, it's going to take 4.25 years for the information to be transmitted back. But this is a serious mission that's being planned. And as an astronomer, I'm all in favor of it, because we can actually put stuff in that 10 centimeter capsule that's going to give us information we're not going to get any other way. And incidentally, it's relatively cheap. They found a way to mass produce these 10 centimeter diameter spaceships. And the propulsion is also cheap. So don't worry too much about, it's way cheaper than the James Webb Telescope by a factor of 10,000 times. So, but that basically tells us whatever's behind the UFO phenomena, they're not physical beings like us. It's something else. But the real evidence, and this incidentally, I cite 6 other physicists in Lights in the Sky, Little Green Men, and these are physicists like me who have spent a minimum of 10 years researching the UFO phenomena. They all agree that we're dealing with something that's real but not physical. Real because we got the craters. We can see the melted snow. We can see the damaged vegetation. But not physical because there's no sonic boom, there is no heat friction, and we go to the site, there's nothing physical that we can recover. And with all these 20 million documented cases, no one has ever been able to produce any physical evidence. But clearly it's real. Something caused those craters. Something melted the snow. Something damaged the vegetation. And people have been harmed by these UFO encounters. It's not benign. And this is what I think is really interesting as well, is when you look at the close encounter database, the best you're going to come away with is recurring, terrifying nightmares. Everyone has had one of these close encounters. They've had deleterious effects. 0% evidence that it's ever beneficial. So the best you're going to come away, so what's the worst you're going to come away with? The worst is you get killed by the phenomena. People have been killed by these close UFO encounters. And it's not just people. There's hundreds of documented cases where the animals that are associated with these people also get injured or killed. But it's only animals that are bonded to the human owner. So like their cow, their dog, their cat, their horse. And often the animal sees the UFO encounter first, and the human sees it again. But the only time animals are affected is when the animals are strongly bonded to the human that also experiences the encounter. That too is an important data point. And then when you look at these close encounters where there's messages, the messages only happen to people who are deeply involved in the occult. There's no evidence of people having a message being sent to them by a UFO craft or a UFO being where the individual has not been deeply involved in the occult. Which is why we close our book off. In Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, we say we are presenting a testable model of UFOs. Testable in this sense. There's a direct correlation between the close encounters and the degree of occult activity of the people who have these encounters. And it explained to me why so many more people in the Soviet Union were having the encounters than here in America, and why the level of encounters in Russia today has plummeted. It's nowhere near what it was like during the Soviet era. And I was only allowed to speak to scientists who had doctoral degrees when I was in the Soviet Union. But as I visited their institutions, I saw that every one of them had a department of occult physics. And the Russians were well aware that they were way behind the United States in terms of technology. Where they thought they could get an edge on us militarily is through occult physics. These departments of occult physics were tasked with finding new weapons. So their goal was to come up with occult weapons that they could use against the West. Well, they never really produced any. Yeah, paranormal. And what I discovered is a lot of the audiences of physicists I was speaking to in the Soviet Union, there was one audience I spoke to where at least a quarter of them were demon-possessed. Now, I'll say this about demon possession. I tell people, hey, if you're a Christian and you run into it, deal with it, but don't seek it out. I believe the demons want to distract us. But if you're confronted with it, you got to deal with it. And then you say, well, were these really demon-possessed people? I would walk into the auditorium, and even before I was introduced or the topic was announced, they would be jumping up and screaming obscenities at me. And not just at me, obscenities at Jesus Christ. And they'd be accusing Jesus Christ of the most vile behavior. Now, I've run into longshoremen that take the Lord's name in vain, but they restrain themselves from accusing Jesus, for example, of being a serial homosexual rapist. You get that from demon-possessed people. Or I would walk into the auditorium and they would run away and cower in the background and kind of curl up into the fetal position. Normal people don't do that. And these are people with doctoral degrees. And it's like everybody else in the audience knew they were demon-possessed. They saw so much of this, they knew exactly what was going on. It's rare in the United States. The reason why it's rare, there's so few of us that are that deeply involved in the occult. I did get to see some of it at Caltech, because there were a couple of physicists, in fact, they're famous physicists, that were secretly involved in occult work. In fact, one of them actually knew some of these Soviet scientists and says, hey, this sounds like something worthwhile investigating. And he was having experiences he wished he didn't have. So it does exist here, but it's rare. But there it was common. And that's something else we see in the database. A lot of this goes on in equatorial Brazil. A lot of this goes on in France. But France and equatorial Brazil is where you got a significant percentage of the population that are significantly involved in the occult, witchcraft, paranormal, etc. And as I've traveled around the United States, there's 2 states where I've been able to see a significantly greater number of people reporting these kinds of phenomena, Hawaii and Alaska. But Hawaii and Alaska is where you also have a higher percentage of people involved in the occult. So that's one of the claims we make in our book. There's a direct correlation between the degree of occult involvement and these UFO experiences, these UFO encounters, and especially where people have a close enough encounter that they're getting a message from these beings. But we also close our book off by saying, if you will take the steps to eliminate the occult from your life, that will be the end of your UFO encounters. And this book has been out for, 18 years now. And I've challenged people, okay, try this and let me know if it doesn't work. It works. Close the doors of the occult. Now, there's one important caveat. You can have these UFO encounters if there's a close relative to you that's deep into the occult and you've not confessed what they are doing as something that violates God's will for us. I had some of that in my own family. And it's important that we acknowledge before God, hey, what's going on in my family is something that you don't approve of and I don't approve of. That will cut the link. But demons do work through close relatives. So I've run into people and say, I got no occult involvement. And so I ask them a lot of questions. And I find out, for example, they have a sexual relationship with a witch. And I say, well, guess what? That's your door. You need to break that relationship off. And they say, oh, okay, I'll take care of that. And then suddenly the UFO encounters go away. Let me say a little bit about the messages that people get. There are documented cases where people have a close encounter and they go into a trance. And when they go into a trance, they actually begin to write. So they're not conscious of what's going on. They're in this trance-like state, but they're on a computer or a typewriter or they're handwriting something. Probably the most famous example of that is something called the Urantia book. It's kind of the Bible of 4 different UFO religions. And yes, there are UFO religions that are operating around the world. And they have hundreds of thousands of people who are part of those cults, which is why I had another author work on this book with me, Kenneth Samples. He's a cult expert. And so he writes the chapter on the UFO religions, the UFO cults. But probably the best example is the Urantia book. 4,000 pages composed when a person was in a trance, also known as automatic writing, where the human author doesn't know what they're writing. They go into this trance-like state, and out comes this book. Well, if you look at the Urantia book, and when I say 4,000 pages, there's different editions. Some editions are as short as 1,000 pages. The print is tiny, but it's a big book. But 1/3 of the content of the Urantia book is denying the deity of Jesus Christ. So that's the other thing we see. There seems to be a commonality to this UFO phenomena where they're intent on diverting people away from the Christian faith. Or they're trying to encourage people to pursue power and abandon truth. Often in these UFO encounters, the so-called UFO beings are promising certain powers to the human encounter. But as a result, they wind up being possessed by a demon, or they wind up believing things that simply are not true. And again, a lot of people are injured and killed. But one of the things I've learned just in my experience with witchcraft and demons is that their goal is to get you to end your life before you give your life to Jesus Christ. And so there's a lot of suicides going on in these close encounters with UFOs. Now, in terms of the latest data release from our US government, and by the way, other governments are following suit, and there's always been classified UFO documents, but what's happening in the news is a lot more of those classified documents are being released. And I think what's new in those documents, we've reported previously in our book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, is that you got credible people having these UFO encounters, astronauts, pilots, scientists that are having these encounters. And what's often, though, is that you'll see these photographs, and you got a photograph of the UFO, but you ask the human observer, did you see it? No, but I photographed it. Or you got people on naval ships where they get a radar bounce, but nothing shows up in photographic film. Or they see it, and they try to get a radar bounce, and nothing happens. And so we got these multiple detection methods, but they're not consistent. Not all the instruments pick up the UFO. Some of them do, and some of them don't. But again, that's what you'd expect if you're dealing with something that's not physical, but real. But I think some of the more spectacular latest releases are saying we got both a radar bounce and we got a photograph, but then they don't have a visual sighting. So they're now finding cases where they got multiple detections, but again, what's consistent, not all the detection devices pick it up. So again, non-physical reality. The physicist that's devoted the most time to studying UFOs is Jacques Vallée. He's a French astrophysicist. He has spent 60 years studying the UFO phenomena. He's basically devoted his entire life to studying the UFO phenomena. I've read his books. What he reports is credible. He's the one that studied the database to the greatest extent. But his conclusion is, and he's not a Christian, he's not even a theist, but he says that what we're dealing with is interdimensional phenomena. This is phenomena coming from dimensions beyond the space-time dimensions of the universe. He says they're real beings, but they're not part of our dimensions. They're not subject to our laws of physics. And I think, again, he's not a theist, he's not a Christian, but I agree with him. We are dealing with an interdimensional phenomena. We're dealing with beings that are not subject to our laws of physics. But when you read the Bible, it tells us that God created two distinct species of intelligent life. Human beings that are constrained by the space-time dimensions of the universe and the laws of physics that govern the universe. And then there are angels that are not subject to our space-time dimensions and are not subject to our laws of physics. And they can come into our realm. We cannot go into their realm. And as it tells us in Hebrews 13:2, many of you have entertained angels unawares. But there again, I want to make a distinction. I believe that passage is referring to the righteous angels. The UFO phenomena is referring to the non-righteous angels. That's something else that you see in all the books that have been published by physicists and astronomers who devoted a minimum of a decade of researching this phenomena. They all agree that we're dealing with an interdimensional phenomena, interdimensional beings, and there's a one-to-one correspondence to what we see in the UFO phenomena and what we see in witchcraft and demonology. And they'll say, I'm the only one of all the authors that's a Christian. They're not theists. But they say whatever's behind the occult is also behind UFOs. Whatever's behind demonology is also behind UFOs. There's a one-to-one correspondence of what's going on there. And I'll tell you a personal story. When I was a graduate student, I was logging 1,500 hours of observing time on the telescopes per year. And there were two astronomers from York University who would come up for a 4-hour observing run once a year. But every time they came up for an observing run, they saw UFOs. And in my entire 5-year career of making all these observations, I never saw a UFO. But every time they came with a telescope, they saw a UFO. And there was a couple of other graduate students who were also logging more than 1,000 hours a year. I said, what about you? He said, well, we're not seeing anything. And there's one astronomer here in America that actually did a survey of observing astronomers all over North America about the UFO phenomena. And I've cited his work, basically making the point, there are astronomers that do have UFO encounters, but every one of them is deeply involved in the occult. I knew these two astronomers, and I knew they were deeply involved in the occult, so I was not at all surprised they were seeing UFOs every time they came on the telescope. But the vast majority of astronomers see nothing. That's interesting too, because when you look at the UFO database, the vast majority of UFO encounters happen between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning, and they happen on lonely country roads. Well, where do astronomers hang out? Lonely country roads between 2 and 4 a.m. in the morning, and the vast majority of them see nothing. So, and again, from a perspective of this being a phenomena that's explained by demons, we would anticipate they would visit at night. This is the time when they can have the greatest impact on their human contactees. Now, in terms of the abductee phenomena, there are people who claim that they not only have been contacted by UFO beings, that they've been taken up onto their spacecraft. But those are the individuals that are the most deeply involved in the occult. And again, there's thousands of cases of people who claim to be abducted, but when you actually question them, they cannot produce any physical evidence that they're actually on board the craft. A lot of them claim to have been sexually violated, but again, they can't really prove that there's any physical evidence of that kind of sexual violation. So again, this is consistent. We're dealing with something that's non-physical and but real, and it's dangerous and it's evil. So I'm going to stop there. I'll take whatever questions you got. And by the way, this is my last lecture here in this trip to St. Louis. I'll take questions on any subject.